Hi everybody, welcome and thanks for checking out the channel. Today we're gonna build the K6ARK 100 watt end-fed half-wave kit. It should be a fairly easy build, but along the way I am gonna do things slightly different than Adam's instructions. When I do those things slightly different, I will let you know, and we're gonna test a few things along the way to ensure that when we finish this kit, it's actually done correctly and we don't have to go back and resolder everything. Let's jump onto the desk and get started. Jumping into things, here it is. First, we have a extra large toroid. This is a Type 43 toroid, and it's nearly 3 times the mass of a T140-43. We're going to use that alongside of this PCB board, which Adam designed and got printed out. Now, this makes it a lot easier because we essentially know where we're going to place all of our wires, as well as our capacitor, and our antenna out, and our counterpoise out as well. Which next up we have our spacer, and the spacer looks like this. Adam designed it, and its purpose is to basically separate the PCB from the toroid. And I think that there's two parts for this. Number one, it helps the wires go into the PCB board a little bit better, but also I think it helps it so if there's any scratches on the magnet wire, it doesn't short out onto that ground that's in the middle of the PCB where the SO239 will go. Speaking of magnet wire, this is the magnet wire that's included in the kit, and we'll just put that to the side here for a moment. This SO239 connector we're going to be using, this is probably not the same one that you have on your kit. I actually had this laying around, and I needed to use this one as opposed to a different one. So if you notice that it's different, don't be too alarmed. Next up, we have the capacitor, and this is a surface-mounted capacitor. The ones I'm using today are 100 PF, 3 kilovolts, but yours might be different depending on Adam's kit. Again, I purchased these separately. The first step we're going to do now that we know our parts is we're going to put the capacitor on the PCB board, and you'll see that I'm using what they call a flux pen in order to put some flux onto the PCB, and it helps the solder flow a little bit better. But you're also going to notice that throughout the episode, I have a problem soldering because that flux pen was out of flux. Anyway, go ahead and remove a capacitor. And I found that the best way to put this capacitor onto the board is to find something that will help you place that capacitor because, well, it gets hot. I'm using a tweezers. Now, I'm going to take this tweezers with the capacitor. I'm going to put it on the board roughly where I think it should go. And the thing about this capacitor is there's really there's no polarity on it. There's no specific way it needs to go. As long as you have both ends of the capacitor soldered, you should be all right. So I kind of put it roughly into place here, and once I get it into place, I'll solder it. Now, it's a capacitor. You just make sure that you don't put so much solder on it that the solder runs under the capacitor and bridges the two soldering points, but just take your time and you'll be fine. Now, I should mention that if you have a stand for your PCB to hold it in place like alligator clips, use them. I don't, so I didn't use it. Got the capacitor in line here, and the next thing that we want to do is we want to test to make sure that there's continuity in this here, or basically ensure that we have this soldered correctly. So let's just check it out on the multimeter. I'll be using this little inexpensive multimeter that I purchased on Amazon, and I set it to continuity and then the ohms value. I go from each side of the capacitor with no real response here. So what I do next is I look at the traces and I follow the traces. I then check that capacitor on the top of the capacitor where I soldered to its respected trace. And basically what I'm doing there is just making sure that my soldering job has bonded enough to the capacitor and the PCB so that it does have continuity to the next step or the next trace. We'll be able to learn about this a little bit more here in just a little bit. Now we're going to basically run our antenna wire and solder that in place, as well as the counterpoise wire. And yeah, it's fairly simple. Basically, on this board, you have something labeled ANT for antenna, and you have a C-poise for your counterpoise. You'll notice that next to both the antenna and the counterpoise, you have these bigger or larger holes that have no... Yeah, don't drop it like that. I'll be right back. As I was saying, you have those larger holes next to the antenna and the counterpoise that have no traces on them. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to use those with our antenna wire to almost secure the antenna wire to make it a little bit more stable so it's not pulling directly on the counterpoise or the antenna trace. I'll show you right now what I mean. And for this, I'm using BNTech 22 gauge silicone wire. Adam recommends that you use Poly Stealth. However, I had some BN-Type-Go laying around, quite a bit of it actually, and I decided to use this. So you see, I'm just going to use my wire cutters here. I'm going to cut a little portion off. I'm going to strip the end of the wire, and I'm going to run it through just as you see here. By the way, this is step 2 if you're following along in the user manual. Now, it does mention that, hey, you're going to basically use that antenna wire and you're going to fish it through the strain relief hole and have it come out near the ANT or antenna pad, which will be on the same side of the capacitor where you're going to solder it. And there's a very clear instruction on Adam's website. For the counterpoise, you'll do the exact opposite, so it will come out the other end. And then solder them into place. So here we go. I'm going to place the solder in, and these holes are large on this kit. And the reason they're large is the more solder you can get on there, the stronger the bond will be with the wire in there. So that's kind of why Adam went with such a large hole. But here we go. I'm just taking my time. I'm soldering it into place. Again, it would be great if I had those alligator clips or some kind of stand for this PCB. But I don't, so I just go ahead and I finish up the soldering job. I cut the excess wire, leave a few inches there. You'll see why in just a little bit. And then I check my work, which is not good. I know it's not good because I could see a hole on the bottom portion of the PCB. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and let my soldering iron kind of on the top portion, I'm going to let it heat up and let it flow down into where that hole was. It's important that you actually get the soldering portion of this done correctly. Otherwise, you might run into intermittent connectivity issues here in the future. So you'd hate to be out in the field and have a problem. Like I mentioned, I went ahead and I cut that antenna wire, and now I just stripped away just a little bit at the end. I'm going to check for continuity here. And once I determine there's continuity, I'm going to do the same thing on the antenna side, except the wire is going to go the opposite way through the strain relief hole. Yeah, and you can see here what I'm doing is I'm just checking the ground because the counterpoise connects to the ground, right? So not only did I check the antenna wire or the counterpoise wire to the soldering point, but then I went to the next trace, which was the ground. Everything looks good. And for the antenna portion, I'm just going to go in, like I said, with the strain relief. The antenna wire comes out the opposite side of the counterpoise. That just makes it easier to know which one's your antenna and counterpoise. Now, if you want to take it a step further, on one of my builds, I made my counterpoise green and I made my antenna wire hot pink or fuchsia. And that allowed me to basically quickly tell which one was antenna and which one was counterpoise. And if you do by mistake put the wires both coming out the same direction, it's not the end of the world. Just kind of make a note of it. I'll show you something in a minute that'll help that. Anyway, go ahead and solder in the antenna wire. Take your time. And again, if you have flux, now's the time to use it. After I soldered everything and stripped away the end of the antenna wire, I'm going to check continuity. And this is really good that I do this now because I'm eliminating all the variables that are going to be in factor. Right now, I have no continuity between the top portion of the antenna wire and the solder joint that I just soldered. What does that tell me? Well, solder probably didn't hit the pad and the antenna wire itself, because as you can see, the antenna wire does have continuity. So I'm going to check and inspect everything now. Again, eliminating all the variables in the future that may occur, because we're probably going to put, like 4 or 5 more soldering points onto here. And let me see. Let's take a look at this here. Again, I'm an amateur. We'll put that out there. But I take a look here, and it doesn't necessarily look horrible until I look at the bottom portion. And again, there's a hole there. So I'm just going to let the soldering iron heat up and kind of like let it flow through and bond together. And now I could check my continuity and I don't have a problem. So I feel much more confident to move on to the next step, knowing that the first 2 steps were done correctly. And before I do that, I'm going to just clean up the board here. I don't know where my snippers went for electrical components, so I'm just using a nail clippers. It actually works pretty well. And I just kind of clean up some of the soldering points that I've already made. Next up, we're going to install the SO239. And people have asked me if you could use a BNC connector in this install, and I guess if you found a washer the correct size, with a BNC. You could put a BNC through the inside of the washer and then onto the board. You'd have to experiment around with that. But here's what we're going to do. You don't need anything on this SO239 except for the nut and the actual SO239 connector itself. As you can see here, I'll go ahead and I'm going to remove it. You might notice that my SO239 connector is different. Again, this kit wasn't purchased from Adam as much as it was sourced out with Adam sending me the board. I'm going to go ahead and place the SO239 in here. Now you're going to see that the SO239, it will fit in here only one way, and that's because there's a notch in the PCB, and that notch on the PCB is really important because without it, that SO239 would continue to turn and turn and turn, eventually probably strip away your antenna wire or your center pin wire that's in there. Now, as I go through all this, you're going to see that there is a certain way that you want to install the SO239, which, by the way, this is step 3 in Adam's instructions, and the SO239 connector with the coax side, the side that is the coax is going to go into, will be toward the bottom capacitor side of the PCB. So basically, we want the coax to plug in, and we'll be able to see the capacitor just like this. But I also want to mention that this little nut that's on here, it does have a little bend to it, so I'm going to flip this around. I'm going to tighten it up. Right now, I'm only hand tightening it. If I was you, now would be a great time to use a needle nose plier or some kind of pliers to tighten this enough where the SO239 connector doesn't move around. I'll do this in a later step, but again, you could do it now. Next up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take about 1.5 inches to 2 inches of that magnet wire. And I know in step 3, Adam says about 1 inch, but I use a little bit more. And I just cut it with a wire cutter. And then what's very important is that you strip away each end of the magnet wire with either sandpaper or, in my scenario, I used a Leatherman knife. And the reason for this is you want to expose that copper so that when we solder this onto both the other side of the SO239 and onto the PCB, we get good continuity. And that's going to be the key of this whole build, is to make sure we're getting good continuity, right? If you don't have continuity, you don't complete the circuit, your auto transformer then doesn't necessarily work correctly. Long story short, we're now going to make sure the exposed end of the copper wire is placed into that SO239 connector, and we're going to solder it. Again, apply enough heat where it gets warm enough and let the solder flow down into it. Otherwise, you'll have holes and gaps, and you might not have great continuity. There's a repeating trend here, but I got to stress it because I think that maybe like 90% of the failures will have to do with poor soldering, and that's not a bad thing. We're all learning here together, and everybody's at different levels. Just make sure you take your time, and you'll know better for next time if that was a problem. So anyway, once I get the actual solder in the SO239 portion, I'm going to go ahead and bend this magnet wire down, and I'm going to place it into the center pin portion and solder that as well. Now, I like to make sure that I don't expose too much wire to the point where I accidentally ground out this center pin or this magnet wire to the ground. Otherwise, you've ruined a lot of stuff, or it not ruined, but it won't work right. I ended up having to recut a new piece of magnet wire and resolder because I cut my first piece of magnet wire too short. Anyway, again, make sure you have a good solder point, check for continuity, and we'll go on to the next step. And I know that looks a little confusing. My apologies. But I'm just checking for continuity between the center pin where the SO239 or where the coax will plug into and the actual center pin labeled on the PCB. The rest of those I was just checking to make sure I didn't have a short. In my opinion, it's a really good time to follow the traces and understand where you're going to have continuity and where you're not going to have continuity, especially if you're new to understanding electrical circuits. It's that time where we're finally going to work on some new stuff here. So let's put that knife away so we don't accidentally cut ourselves, which does definitely happen, by the way. Anyway, here's what we're going to do. We have this board now. We have this board partially soldered, and we have the spacer. So we're going to apply the spacer onto the board, and then we're going to apply the toroid on top of the spacer. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. Adam designed the spacer, and he had in mind the center pin wire. And basically, this spacer is only going to go one way. We have the wide end facing the PCB, and there's a gap in there for the actual magnet wire that's currently there. We don't need to fish it through. We don't need to do any kind of strain relief. We just place it over. And that's almost like a helmet. It's protecting that magnet wire. And then the next step is we're going to place the toroid on top of it. But first, we have to wind our toroid. Now, this is the part where I'm going to be a little bit different than Adam. I chose to wind my toroid the way that I've kind of typically wound toroids before. So to get started, I'm going to unwrap all that magnet wire. And I'm going to actually take about 8 inches or so off the end. I'm going to fold it back and then twist it. You can see how it's twisted. It almost looks braided here. Now, the first time I did this, I didn't have enough. I basically wanted to see if I could wrap that braided portion around the toroid twice. So I needed to add a little bit more. I unbraided everything and then I rebraided it. Just a hot tip, if you have a vice grip, you could put the open end and the long wire into the magnet wire, and then when you have the close end, you could use a pen and you can twist, and it'll give you a nice braid on the actual magnet wire itself. I do want to mention that I'm starting off with these twisted pairs. The twisted pair is intertwined with the secondary, so we have 2 turns on the primary, but we also right here have 2 turns on the secondary. You're going to see that my closed end is on the right-hand side the way I'm doing it, and my open end is going to be right now on the left-hand side. I do also want to mention we're going to continue on wrapping the secondary. That's going to be the long portion of the magnet wire. And we've already have 2 turns on the magnet wire for the secondary, so this is the 3rd turn. We count turns on the inside when we fully go around the inside of the toroid. That's the magnetic field. So we now have 2 turns on the primary and 3 turns on the secondary. I'm adding a 4th now. I'm going to continue until I have a total of 14 turns on the secondary. That will give me 14 to 2. 2 divided by 14 is 7. 7 to the 7th power is 49. 49 to 1. And I'll be right back. Now, I did forget a couple of things, so I want to tell you about them. Number 1, you're going to notice that I have a cross in my magnet wire here on the internal portion. I don't like that, so I'm just going to make sure that they're nice and evenly spaced. And once I make sure that they're evenly spaced, I do also want to point out that I'm not pulling on these too hard, this magnet wire. I'm kind of shaping it into and around the magnet wire. And the reason for that is I don't want to scrape that magnet wire on the toroid or on the opposite side of the toroid. Essentially, if it hits the PCB in any way, I don't want to short anything out. Again, I'm trying to prevent anything from getting shorted out, which could cause issues in the future with our standing wave ratio being intermittent, especially if it's intermittently grounding out or shorting out. So anyway, I count like 40 million times if I have 14 turns yet, and when I finally get there, I feel accomplished. Here it is, our toroid winding. We have 3 sets of wires coming off of the toroid itself, or the auto transformer. And those 3 sets, there's one on the left that's going to go from our center pin essentially, or the in portion on our PCB. The one in the middle that I'm twisting, that's going to go to the ground, or the GND. Now, the thing about this is we're going to cut these all in just a moment, but we want to align them on the PCB first. Finally, we have the one on the right. That's going to go to our out, and it's going to complete the circuit with the antenna wire portion of our circuit. It's a very hard thing to demonstrate, but again, I have my plastic spacer or my 3D printed spacer on there. And now I'm just taking that wire on the left and it's going to in. I'm going to fish it through, and I'm going to fish the wire on the right, which will go to out, and I'm going to fish that through, which then will help me fish the ground through at the end. So I'm kind of like working it in there. I noticed here while I was working and everything that I kind of had a cross on my wire, so I just took a step back, straightened everything out, and then continued on. So now I'm working with this ground wire that's twisted pair, and the hole that it's going to go to is recessed in a little bit on the PCB. At this point, I decided to only slightly cut my magnet wire where it's twisted, and that kind of helps me get the magnet wire through that ingressed or recessed PCB hole. And then once I do that, I'm able to use a needle nose plier to pull the in, the ground, and the out through the PCB, which does help tighten up or strengthen the toroid that's on top of that spacer, but not fully. Again, that'll happen when we weatherproof this or we apply the heat shrink on here. So as you see now, I'm pulling all three of these sets of wires through the PCB. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a knife or sandpaper, and I'm going to sand them away again. This sounds like a reoccurring theme, because once I sand them away, I'm going to then solder everything, and I want to make sure I have a good connection. The ground, which had the twisted pair, we need to make certain that that ground has stripped bare copper wire on both portions of that twisted pair. That's not the best technique for that knife, by the way. But alas, when we finally do strip away that magnet wire at the ends, we're going to start our soldering. Now you'll notice I left one of the leads on the magnet wire long, and I'm not really exactly sure why I did that, but I will eventually cut it, strip it, and solder it. So here we are. I'm just going to solder all three of those. Now, one of the things I want to make a note of when you're soldering these traces are close together. So with the technique that I'm using right now with soldering, and my apologies if it's blurry, there's the potential that all the solder that I'm putting onto here is going straight down onto the other side of the PCB board, which might not be a problem where I'm at now, but when we work with the ground and what I think is the antenna out, where my thumb was just now, there's a potential that so much solder there actually bridges the gap between the ground and that magnet wire that's left long right there. And if that happens, you have to take your time to try to remove the solder, so it could add more steps and become more frustrating. So again, just take your time. The next thing I do is I check the outer shield and the inner portion of the SO239, and I have continuity between the two. So, I mean, I'm doing all right here at this point. At this point, I could also probably check to see if there's continuity following the traces. I did that, just not necessarily on camera. And at that point, I feel that since I have continuity on the outer shield and the inner portion of the SO239, that I'm probably good, and I say probably good, to put the heat shrink on. Except before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put about 2,450 ohms in between the antenna and the counterpoise wires, and then I'm going to hook this up to some kind of analyzer, a VNA. The reason I'm going to do that is I want to check to see if the standing wave ratio looks okay, if there's some kind of response when I add resistance in between the two. If there's no change in the standing wave ratio when I add resistance between the two, yeah, I might have a problem at that point. So, you know, the theory is, and I've already actually made a video on this, so maybe I'll just link you to that below. But the theory in short, and probably not incomplete theory, would be that if you put in 2,450 ohms or even 2,500 ohms in between the two, and you check the standing wave ratio, you should see a dip, and you should have a close to resonant antenna somewhere. And if you don't, then you don't see any change or fluctuation, then you know you have a problem. And before going off too much on me in the comments about how I wasn't very detailed here, I do really suggest you go and watch that other video that I had just mentioned. That should explain in a lot more detail. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead now, and I've decided I'm confident at this point that I could put the heat shrink on my toroid. And I'm not going to show you how I heat shrink this, but basically I put the heat shrink on top of it. I covered the PCB slightly. I cut the heat shrink just above where the toroid would be, or slightly above it. And then I went to the garage and I used an actual heat gun. If you don't have a heat gun, maybe a blow dryer would work. But basically I applied the heat gun until the heat shrink shrunk enough where it tightly gripped both the PCB and the toroid. And I should mention that you might not even need to cut your heat shrink. I just had a really large piece of heat shrink. It was about 1 foot long, so that's why I had to cut mine. But here you're going to see I just double check real quick and make sure that I still have continuity between that outer shield and that inner shield. So everything's looking cool here. I'm excited. And I'm going to install banana plugs on the antenna wire and the counterpoise wire. When I do that, I'm going to make sure that I install a male on one of them and a female on the other one. The reasoning for this is then when I cut the antenna wire, I will never get the antenna wire mixed up with the counterpoise wire. This is especially useful if you're using two black wires. Again, earlier I mentioned it would be wise to use something like a green wire for your counterpoise and a fuchsia wire for your antenna, but you get the point. What I do want to also mention that you could take some small heat shrink and place it over the antenna wire right here and slightly over the banana adapter or connector, and then use the heat shrink so that you don't have that weird gap in between the antenna wire and the banana connector. But regardless, I went ahead and I have banana connectors installed on both ends of the wire now. Okay, this next part I'm not going to really go into a lot of detail about because it's antenna wire. There's many different ways that you can configure your antenna wire. You could do an 80 meter end-fed half wave, which would require a coil. You could do a linked end-fed half wave, which would give you more bands, but would require more banana plugs, and probably something like this that you could fish the wire through with, so there's strain relief. So with all that, I'm just going to tell you like my 40 meter end-fed half wave spiel. I decided on a 40 meter end-fed half wave, and I decided I was going to have it in a sloper configuration from 25 feet down to about 4 feet. Okay. At that point, I put 65 feet of wire out for 40 meter end-fed half wave. That should give me 40 meters, 20 meters, 15 meters, and 10 meters. And 65 feet is around a end-fed half wave or a half wave of 40 meters. And so here we are in the sloper configuration from 25 feet to 4 feet. I plug everything in and I check an antenna analyzer, and I'm not resonant on 40 meters because, well, I need to figure out why, right? Well, it turns out that I'm actually resonant around 6.8 megahertz. Well, what do I got to do then? I need to cut the wire. Why do I have to cut the wire? Because the higher you go in frequency, the shorter the antenna needs to be. And the lower you go in frequency, the longer the antenna needs to be, if that makes sense. So because I was at 6 point something megahertz, I knew that I needed to cut the wire to be resonant around 7.1 megahertz. And once I was resonant there, I checked 20 meters, I checked 15 meters, I checked 10. I did some fine tuning until I had all the bands pretty close. Now, you don't need an antenna tuner, and you don't need to be perfect 1-to-1 everywhere on the band, but I like to stay below 2-to-1, 1.8 to 1, 1.7 to 1, 1.5 to 1, whatever. It works, it works. And I did those on those 4 bands by operating with this. And by the way, I did have my counterpoise wire hooked up. It's always good to have a counterpoise in line, especially if you're using less than like 18 or 20 feet of coax. This video rather, was made in order to maybe kind of visually assist you with building an end-fed half wave. By no means should I be taken as an expert. I never said I was. If you have any suggestions in the comments below, please let me know. But I do encourage you to go check out my other end-fed half wave videos before you jump to any conclusions on this one, because it seems like there's always some times where I'm having to reiterate some things that I've mentioned in other end-fed half wave videos. I'll make a playlist and I'll leave it below. But until next time, thanks for checking out the channel. Hope this helped you out. 73.